You've seen this shot 1,000 times. Seriously, once I say it, you're going to realize that you can picture it instantly. A politician at a podium, flags behind them, microphones in front, and just over their shoulder, there's a group of people, a very specific group of people. Maybe a guy in a hard hat, a woman in scrubs, maybe small business owner, a lot of times soldiers, sometimes a family, always positioned just right. And here's the thing that starts to feel a little strange once you notice it. They never interrupt. They never lean in to offer anything to say, hey, that's not exactly how that went. They don't disagree. They don't clarify. They don't even look confused. They're just there. Smiles on their faces, nodding at the right moments, clapping at the right moments, reacting exactly how you'd expect them to react if everything that was being said was landing perfectly. And once you see that, once you really see it, you stop listening to the speech. You start watching the people behind it. And that's when a different question starts to creep in. Those people didn't just wander in off the street and accidentally end up behind the president. They were chosen. They were positioned. They were framed. That's not just a crowd. It's not just a random group of people. It's part of the message. And every once in a while, one of those people has a story that doesn't quite match the one being told. Like a DoorDash driver named Sharon Simmons, who showed up at the White House as the perfect example of a policy working, while living a reality that raises a completely different question. And once you hear her full story, you'll start to realize this isn't a one-off thing. It's a pattern, a system. So let's talk about it. Happy Monday, all, and welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we're going to be talking about the concept of human props, specifically in the realm of politics and political speeches. So before we go any further, we need to define exactly what we're looking at here, because once you name something, it gets a lot harder to ignore. What you're seeing in those moments that I described, those carefully arranged groups of, quote, everyday Americans standing behind a politician, are what we call human props. Now, I know, it sounds harsh. It sounds like you're accusing people of being fake or staged or somehow in on something. And that's really not what this is. In fact, the reason this works so well is because the people involved are not fake. They're real. They have real jobs, real lives, real problems. In a lot of cases, they genuinely support the person they're standing behind. They're not reading from a script. They're not actors hitting their marks in the traditional sense. But, and this is the part that matters, they are selected. They're being positioned. They're being framed. That's the difference. Because when you see a group of people behind a politician, your brain doesn't just register them as background. You start building a story almost instantly. You think, okay, well, these people are the kinds of people this policy affects. These are the people benefiting from this. Or even more simply, these are the people who support this. And that reaction is automatic, and it's not an accident. Think about how different the exact same speech would feel depending on who's standing behind the speaker. If someone is talking about manufacturing jobs and behind them are a bunch of executives in suits, that hits one way. If behind them are workers in hard hats and steel-toed boots, that hits a completely different way. All the words are the same. The policy is the same. Totally different emotional response. And that's the point. It's not just about what's being said. It's about what you're being shown while it's being said. Because visuals do something that words just don't. They shortcut the thinking process. They let you feel like you understand something without having to break it down piece by piece. You see the people and your brain fills in the rest. These are the people this is for. Even if what you're seeing is only one carefully selected slice of reality. And that's where this starts to shift from just being normal political staging into something a little more deliberate. Because those people are not random. Somebody decided that they should be there. Somebody decided they represent the message. Somebody decided that this is what the audience should see during this speech. And again, that doesn't mean anything being presented is false. It just means it's incomplete. It's curated. It's a version of reality arranged to make a specific point land cleanly and quickly. A cleaner version, a simpler version, a more useful version. And once you start looking at it that way, the whole thing feels a good bit different, because now it's not just, oh, these are supporters. Now it's, why these supporters? Why this person? Why this job? Why this background? What is it with this exact mix? And if you're being honest, you already know the answer. It's because they fit the story being told. They reinforce it. They make it feel real and grounded and relatable. They make it feel true, even if the full reality is much, much more complicated. And this is where the phrase really clicks. Real people edited into a message. You're not being shown something fake. You're being shown something filtered, something shaped, arranged to answer the question, what do we need the audience to feel right now? And if that sounds a little theatrical, that's because it is. Because the way this actually comes together looks a lot less like a spontaneous gathering and a lot more like a production. Before a politician ever steps up to a podium, there are a team of people whose entire job is to figure out what that moment is going to look like. Not just what's going to be said, but what's going to be seen. These are advanced teams, communication staff, event planners, and they're thinking in terms of visuals. Where is this happening? What's in the background? What reinforces the message immediately without the need of any explanation? Again, if it's a speech about jobs, you don't just pick any room. You pick a factory or a shop floor or somewhere that feels like work the second the cameras turn off. And then you think about who's in the shot, not just in the audience, but in that tight frame behind the speaker that's going to end up on every clip and every news segment and every social media post. And this is where it starts to feel less like politics and more like casting, because that's essentially what it amounts to. You're looking for people who visually represent the message. Workers, veterans, small business owners, families, whatever, depending on the topic. And again, these are real people. They're not being selected randomly. They're not actors hired to play a role. They're being selected because they fit the story. Sometimes that means inviting specific people. Sometimes it means working with local groups. Sometimes it means pre-screening who's going to be where. And yeah, sometimes it means knowing exactly who's going to be in that shot before the event even starts. And once they're there, it doesn't stop. There's subtle guidance, where to stand, where to look, stay engaged, be visible. There's no scripts. Nobody's handing out scripts, but there's an understanding that you're part of the moment. And then the cameras come on, and what you see at home is not the full scene. It's a framed version of it. Tight shots, controlled angles, carefully chosen reactions. You're not seeing everything. You're seeing exactly what you're supposed to see. And when that clip gets cut down and shared, it becomes even more distilled, even more focused. Now it's not just a moment, it's a message in its purest form. And here's the thing that's easy to miss. All of this is normal. This isn't some hidden trick. This is how modern political communication works. It's understood, it's expected, it's part of the process. Because in a world where most people are only catching a few seconds of anything, visuals carry a huge amount of weight. You can control the visual, you can shape how the message lands. And some politicians understand that better than others. Some use it as a tool, and some lean into it so consistently, so deliberately, that it stops being a supporting element and starts becoming a strategy in and of itself. And when that happens, when the visual becomes just as important as the words, that's when examples like Sharon Simmons stop feeling like isolated moments and start feeling like something a bit bigger. All right, so this is where the whole thing stops being abstract, because up to this point, you can still kind of keep the idea, I don't know, sort of at a safe distance. You can nod along and say, yeah, politics is staged, of course it is. Optics matter, blah, 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 nothing new here. And that's true as far as that goes, but every once in a while, you get one example that pulls the whole machine into focus. One example where the person, the backdrop, the message, and the reality behind the message all collide in a way that makes the tactic a lot harder to ignore. And an example of that is Sharon Simmons. And the reason this story matters is not because she's fake, not because she's secretly an actress, not because she was invented in a think tank by Republican consultants wearing headsets and drinking bad coffee. It matters for the opposite reason. It matters because she is real. Her work is real. Her financial pressures are real. Her life is real. That's what gives the moment its power. Sharon Simmons is a DoorDash driver. According to DoorDash, she's been dashing since 2022 and has completed more than 14,000 deliveries. 14,000. That is not somebody hopping in the car once in a while for a little mad money. That is not, I do this for fun to get out of the house. That is a serious volume of work. That is a person doing real, grinded out gig labor. So when she appears at the White House during an event tied to no tax on tips, the visual logic is obvious, and it lands instantly. A delivery driver, a policy tied to tipped income, hardworking older woman, the image practically builds its own talking point. Before anybody even opens their mouths, the frame is already doing a large part of the heavy lifting. And that is exactly why she was so useful in that moment. Because she looked like the story they wanted to tell. Now, the moment itself was staged. DoorDash even pushed back on criticisms by basically saying, look, no one claimed this was a real delivery. This was obviously a planned event marking a policy milestone. Which, honestly is kind of the point. The company's defense wasn't, no, this was spontaneous. Their defense was, of course it was planned. Right, exactly. That's what we're talking about. Sharon Simmons is brought into this carefully orchestrated White House event. She stands there next to Donald Trump. He asks her whether she voted for him. He says he's heard she's a great supporter, and her answer was maybe. And I have to tell you, that one little maybe says a lot, because it breaks the cleanness of the moment just for a second. It lets a little actual humanity leak into the performance. It's not a polished yes. It's not the kind of emphatic answer that fits neatly into a bumper sticker. It's awkward in a normal person way, which, ironically makes her seem even more real. But the real heart of this story isn't that exchange. The heart of the story is why she says this policy matters to her. She has said that no tax on tips has saved her thousands while her husband battles cancer. Now, stop right there, because that is where the whole thing shifts. On camera, what you're seeing is a cheerful, useful, politically convenient symbol of a policy win. But just beneath that image is a much messier, much more revealing reality. Her husband is battling cancer, and she's out there doing gig work in that context. Just think about that for a moment. That's not some side detail. That is not background color. That's not a tiny footnote that you mention at the end and then just move on. That is the story, or at least, it should be. She is standing there as proof that a tax policy is helping ordinary Americans like her, but the reason she is in a position to need that help in the first place is because there is a serious medical crisis in her family. That's not a minor detail. That's the entire moral tension of the moment. And this is where the tactic becomes visible, because the event doesn't want the audience dwelling on that question. The event doesn't want people thinking about the horrible state of the healthcare system and the healthcare insurance industry and all of the people who have fallen through the gap and don't have coverage when they really need it. The event wants the audience to feel a simpler thing. Look, this policy helps people like her. Clean, efficient, and emotionally effective. And to be fair, it may well help her. She has said it does. That matters. I'm not brushing that aside. She is not being forced to say something she doesn't believe. Her answer to the "did you vote for me" question sort of proves that, as well as he also asked her in one of his wandering threads from the topic, her thoughts on transgender athletes, and she refused to answer. She explained that's not why she was there. She is not a cardboard cutout. She is a real person saying a real policy has benefited her financially. But that's not the same as saying the frame tells the whole truth. Because the fuller truth raises a much harder question. Why is someone with a spouse battling cancer relying on app-based gig work and tip income to help keep things afloat in the first place? That question points in a totally different direction. That question takes you away from the neat applause line and into something much, much more uncomfortable about healthcare costs and insecurity and patchwork survival and the way people in this country are constantly trying to fill gaps with hustle. That question is a buzzkill if your goal is a clean policy celebration. So the frame quietly steers you away from that. That is what selective storytelling looks like. It's not fabrication. It's not necessarily even deception in the most blunt sense. It's selection, emphasis, omission. A real person with a real story reduced to the parts of that story that best serve the message. And then there's the other part of this that really matters. This was not her first political appearance. She had already been featured in other Republican messaging around the same issue. She appeared in a Ways and Means Committee hearing in Nevada in July of 2025, talking about how the bill would help her stay more connected with family and help her future. Republican Congressman David Kustoff highlighted her story. A few days before the White House event, Jason Smith shared a video of her promoting the same general message. There was even confusion in public-facing descriptions about where she lived. Was it Missouri or Nevada or Arkansas? Because she had moved which only added to the weirdness of watching her become this repeat use symbol in different settings and then put forth as a DoorDash driver who would deliver to the White House in Washington, D.C. So we're clearly not looking at some random one-off. We're looking at a person whose story has become politically useful enough to keep bringing her back on stage. And again, that does not make her story any less real. I want to keep hammering that because it matters. The cheap version of this critique would be to sneer and say, oh, she's a plant. But that's lazy. The stronger point is more honest. She is real, and that is precisely why she works so well as a political prop. She supports the policy. She has lived the experience. She can speak from that experience, but the more she is reused in these carefully framed settings, the more obvious it becomes that she is no longer just being treated as an individual. She's being turned into a symbol, a visual argument. She's not there because her story proves the whole point. She's there because her story feels like it proves the point. And those are not the same thing. The distinction matters because politics loves emotional shortcuts. It loves stories that can carry the weight of the whole argument in one face or one anecdote. One person standing in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. It lets politicians skip over complexity and go straight to the emotional conclusion that they want you, the audience, to reach. And look at her. Listen to her. See? This works. But the fuller reality is always messier. The fuller reality is a woman doing relentless gig work while dealing with a sick family member being brought onto multiple political stages to reinforce a message that only captures one small portion of her situation. That is what makes this such a strong example. It's not because it's fake. It's because it is real and incomplete at the same time. And once you see that, once you understand how a real person can be used to tell a cleaner story than reality actually allows, you start to realize Sharon Simmons is not the exception. She's the pattern in focus. And once that pattern comes to focus, you start looking backward. You start noticing that politics has been doing versions of this for a very long time. Different faces, different issues, but the same basic mechanism. And that's where I want to go next, because Sharon Simmons may be the current example, but she's definitely not the first. Once you really see what's happening with Sharon Simmons, you see how a real person with a real story can be placed into a moment that tells a cleaner version of reality. You start doing something almost automatically. You start thinking of other ones. You look backward. Say, wait a second, haven't I seen this before? And yeah, you have. Because this isn't new. What's changed isn't the existence of the tactic. What's changed is how refined it's become and how aggressively it's used in certain cases. And again, I can't dance around it. Donald Trump, more than most modern politicians, has taken this idea and leaned into it as a core strategy. Not just something that supports the message, but something that is the message. And I mean, that doesn't mean he invented it. It means he recognized, or someone recognized, how powerful it is and just kept pushing it. But if you rewind the tape, you can see earlier versions of this at the time didn't feel quite as obvious. Take Samuel Joseph Wurzelbacher. You might remember him as Joe the Plumber from the 2008 election. At the time, he became this central figure in the messaging of John McCain. He asked a question about taxes, and suddenly, he wasn't a guy with a question anymore. He became the guy, the symbol, the shorthand for an entire argument about how tax policy affects working Americans. And again, just like with Sharon Simmons, nothing about him was fake. He was a real person with a real concern, but the moment he got pulled into that narrative, something shifted. He stopped being an individual and he became a representation. And the representation was cleaner than the reality. Because when people started digging into his actual financial situation, it didn't quite line up perfectly with the way he was being used in the argument. It wasn't that everything was wrong. It was that everything had been simplified and smoothed out, made more useful. He became more valuable as a symbol than as a person. And once you recognize that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. Think about how often you've seen politicians standing in front of rows of workers, maybe a giant piece of machinery behind them. You don't even need a specific speech. It's almost like stock image at this point. And yes, Donald Trump has used that image constantly. Factories, construction sites, manufacturing floors. The visuals are consistent. The message is baked into the image before he even speaks the first word. Strength, industry, jobs, working class connection. But to be fair, it's not just him. Joe Biden did versions of this too. Democrats and Republicans both understand that if you can show the audience who a policy is for, you don't have to spend nearly as much time explaining the policy. And this is where the difference matters. Trump uses it more frequently, more aggressively, and more centrally. It's not just a supporting visual, it's baked into the delivery of the message itself. It's not, here's what I'm saying, and here are some people behind me. It's more, here is the image, and what I'm saying relates to that image. That's a different level. And you see the same thing with law enforcement backdrops and military backdrops, small business owners, any group that carries a symbolic weight. You put a line of police officers behind a speech about crime, and you've already told part of the story. You've already signaled authority, legitimacy, and alignment. But again, those officers probably genuinely agree, or at least they may genuinely agree. They may be there in total support. That's not the issue. The issue is selection. You're not seeing all perspectives from that group. You're not seeing, you're seeing the ones that fit the message being delivered in the moment. That's the through line. Different people, different contexts, but the same mechanism. Real individuals placed into a narrative that simplifies something rather complex into something immediately digestible. And on one level, you can shrug and say, well, yeah, that's communication. People use examples. They tell stories. And all that's true. But this is a step beyond storytelling. This is staging. It's a difference between telling you about someone and then placing them behind you so their presence reinforces your message without them saying a word. That's control. And when you combine that level of control with real people and real stories, it becomes incredibly effective and incredibly easy to overlook until you start asking different questions. Not just, is this staged, but what does it feel like to be the person in that frame? Because not everyone walks away from those moments feeling like their story was told the way they wanted to have it told. And this is where the whole thing starts to get more personal. Take someone like Jessica DeVoe. She attended a rally. She was part of the crowd. And then through photos and clips, she became part of the message. Her image was used and shared, interpreted, attached to ideas that went far beyond whatever her individual perspective might have been. And here's the thing. Once that happens, you don't control it anymore. You don't control how your face is used. You don't control what assumptions people make about you. You don't get to jump into every repost and say, well, wait, actually, here's what I really meant. You're now a symbol. And symbols don't get nuance. They don't get context or complexity. They get flattened into whatever message they're being used to support. And that's the trade-off. And not everyone fully understands that trade-off when they're going in. Another example, Terry Raines. She appeared behind Trump holding a sign at a rally. In the moment, it looked like clear, straightforward support. It fit the message. It worked wonderfully as a visual. But afterward, she expressed discomfort with how it was interpreted, how her presence was used, how the moment was framed, and that's the part you don't see in the clip. You don't see the second thoughts. You don't see the moment where someone realizes, that's not exactly how I would have put it. Because by then, it's already out there. It's been clipped and shared and reframed and absorbed by millions of people who will never hear the follow-up. And this isn't limited to rallies. Think about the rollout of the Affordable Care Act during the Barack Obama years. There were real people brought forward to tell their stories, people who genuinely benefited from the policy. But even there, some participants later said their situations were much more complicated than it was presented, that their stories had been dumbed down and simplified to fit the message, that the nuance didn't make it into the narrative. Same pattern, real person, real experience, edited into something cleaner. Once you step into that frame, once your face becomes part of that message, you're giving up a certain amount of control over how your story is told. That's just the reality of it. And look, you can argue that this is part of the deal, that if you stand behind a politician, you're implicitly signing up for that. And there is some truth to that. But there's a difference between standing behind someone and being used to represent something broader than you actually believe. That's where this gets uncomfortable. Because now it's not just about messaging, it's about ownership. Who owns your story? You or the person trying to make a point? And once you start asking that question, it changes how you see those moments. Because now when you look at someone standing behind a politician and smiling and nodding and playing their role, you're not just seeing a supporter. You're seeing someone whose story has been placed into a bigger narrative that they may not fully control. And that doesn't automatically make it wrong, but it definitely makes it worth paying attention to. Because the reason this works so well, the reason it's so effective, is because it feels authentic. It feels human. It feels grounded. And to a certain extent it is, but it's also curated. And that combination, real people, curated message, is exactly what makes it so powerful and so easy to miss. Until you stop and ask why it works in the first place. Because once you understand that part, you don't just see it, now you understand it. And that's where we're going next. I want to talk about where it crosses the line. So at this point, you've seen the pattern, you've seen how it's put together, you've seen how it plays out with someone like Sharon Simmons. You've seen that it's not new, and you've seen what it can feel like for people who end up inside that frame. The next question is the one I think that really matters. Why does it work so well? Because it clearly does. And that answer isn't just because politicians are good at messaging. It goes a little deeper than that. It has to do with how we, as people, process information in the first place. Your brain is wired to trust what it can see. Not in a philosophical sense, but in a very practical, almost lazy sense. Visual information is fast. It's efficient. It doesn't require much effort to process. You don't have to stop and analyze a paragraph of policy language. You don't have to break down statistics. You just look and you get a feeling. Oh, okay, this makes sense. That's the shortcut. And that shortcut is incredibly powerful. If you see a politician talking about helping workers and behind them are workers who look like they're benefiting, your brain connects the dots instantly. It doesn't pause and say, well, hold on, is this a representative sample? Are there other perspectives missing here? It just absorbs the image and moves on. That's not you being dumb. That's you being human. And once you understand that, you understand why this tactic is so effective. It's not trying to convince you through argument. It's trying to convince you through association. This policy equals these people. These people look like this. Therefore, the policy works. It's clean, it's immediate, and it feels right. And once that feeling is there, it's very hard to undo. Even if you hear later information that complicates the picture, that initial impression still sticks. That's why visuals are so powerful. They don't just inform your thinking, they anchor your thinking. And this is where we really need to be honest about something. This is not a left-right issue. This is not a one party does this and the other doesn't situation. Everybody does this. Democrats do it, Republicans do it, campaigns do it, advocacy groups do it. It's baked into how modern communication works. But, and this is the part we've already touched on, it's not used equally. Some lean into it more than others. And in the current landscape, as I've said, Trump has taken this idea and pushed it further than we've really seen before. Not just occasionally, not just strategically, but consistently as a core part of how the message is delivered. The visuals are not secondary, they are central. Once you recognize that, you start to see why moments like Sharon Simmons' appearance aren't accidents. They're not one-off examples. They're part of a broader approach to communication that prioritizes what people see and feel over what they stop and take time to analyze. And that brings us to the point where this starts to get a bit uncomfortable because there's a line here. There's a difference between using examples to illustrate a point and using people to stand in for a reality that's far more complicated than what's being presented. There's a difference between highlighting a person's experience and shaping that experience into something that feels more definitive than it actually is. And the tricky part is that line is not always obvious. Because again, nothing we've talked about requires anyone to tell a lie. That's where the effectiveness is here. You can stay technically accurate while still presenting a version of reality that leaves important pieces out. You can tell a true story that leads people to a conclusion that is not the full picture. That's where this crosses from communication into something a little more manipulative. Not in a dramatic over-the-top way, not in so much in a gotcha sense, but in a quieter way. In a way that says, we're going to show you something real, but we're going to show you it in a way that leads you where we want you to go. And once you see that, you start to realize the problem isn't the people in the frame. Sharon Simmons is not the problem. Jessica DeVoe was not the problem. Terry Raines was not the problem. The problem was the way their stories were being used. Because those people I mentioned don't control that usage. Once they're in the frame, once the camera captures that image, it gets cut and shared and reposted and interpreted in ways that go far beyond the moment itself. That's where the idea of human props really lands. Not as an insult, but as a description. They're part of the construction of the message. So the question becomes, what do you do with that? Because you're not going to stop seeing it. If anything, you're going to see it more now that you're aware of it. And this is where we shift from analysis to something more practical. You don't have to become cynical about everything you see. You don't have to assume every person behind every politician is being used in some sinister way. But you should ask better questions. Why these people? Why this setting? What story is this image trying to tell me? And maybe most importantly, what am I not being shown? Because that's where the missing context usually lives, in the details that don't fit neatly into whatever the message is that is being delivered. In the parts of the story that would make things feel more complicated, less certain, less emotionally clean. Once you start asking those questions, something will shift. You don't just absorb the image anymore. Now you interpret it. You see it for what it is, a constructed moment built to make you feel a particular way. Now, that doesn't mean that you reject it outright. It just means that you don't accept it blindly. And that's a big difference, because now when you see someone standing behind a politician, you're not just seeing a supporter. You're seeing a piece of a larger story. And you're aware that there's more to their story than what's being shown. Which brings us back to where we started. That image, that familiar shot you've seen 1,000 times. Politician at a podium, flags behind them, and a group of very specific people standing just over their shoulder. Now when you see that, you're going to notice it differently. You're going to watch the background. You're going to think about why these people are there. And maybe, just maybe, you'll pause for a second before letting that image tell you what to think. Because the next time you see someone like Sharon Simmons standing with a politician being presented as the perfect example of something that works, it's worth asking yourself a simple question. Are you seeing her story? Or are you seeing a version of it designed to make a point? And once you start asking that question, you probably won't stop. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. I want to hear from you. I want to know what you think about the concept of human props in politics. Are there examples that you remember that I forgot? Do you agree with my position on this, or do you think something different? I'm interested in questions and comments and critiques, and whatever it is that you have, I want to hear it. So go to the podcast webpage, www.neighborontheleft.com, and go to the contacts page. Whether you use the social media links to send a direct message, or you use the email address to send an email, reach out and let me know what you think. While you're on the website, you can also check out the streaming page. The every episode of the podcast is there for you to listen to or download, going all the way back to the first episode. And also, don't forget the blog section of the website. I post blog entries that mirror what I talk about on the podcast. And maybe the most important piece of that is it shows you all of the sources that I use for the things that I present. I'll be back on Wednesday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.